So when it comes time to start adding animation to your game, there are really two primary ways to go about it. The first one, and probably the most commonly used, is sprite sheet animation. This is also the technique that most people recognize from traditional animated movies, because it simply means drawing a bunch of images, each with a tiny bit of movement, and then playing them back by quickly displaying them one by one. Our character from the previous video on 2D movement already has sprite sheet animation set up in exactly this way, so that's what we're going to be using for this video. But first, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 22,000 quality classes on game development, tech, and more. If, for example, you want to learn how to create your own custom game art, I really suggest checking out this awesome course on the fundamentals of creating pixel art for games. It's a really well-structured and visual course that I personally really enjoyed. A premium Skillshare membership gives you unlimited access to all classes for less than $10 a month. So to get started, simply click the link in the description and the first 500 people will receive their first 2 months for free. Also, special thanks to Michael Neely, Clinton Fanskiwa, Andrew Kalinenko, Cheetah3D, and Alexander Blair for their support on Patreon. And I think we're now ready to start animating our character. However, there is another approach that I think you should at least be familiar with, and that is skeletal animation. As the name suggests, this animation technique works by binding bones to our sprites, which will then move and distort the images as we drag the bones around. The cool thing about this particular workflow is that it allows us to draw our character only once and then animate him fully inside of Unity. If you want to try out skeletal animation, Unity has a free asset on the asset store called Animate 2D that should help you get started. And definitely let us know if this is something that you would like to see a dedicated video on. Alright, enough talking, let's start animating. So we're here in the same scene as when we did our 2D movement. You can of course use any scene and character that you'd like. In this one we're able to move and jump around as well as crouch beneath platforms. But of course currently we have no animations in here. To change this, let's start by setting up some animation clips. To do this, we'll go to our scene view and select our player. We'll then open up our animation window. So we'll go under Window, Animation, and select Animation. And as you can see, it tells us that to begin animating the player, we need to create both an animator and an animation clip. We'll talk about the difference between the two in a sec. For now, let's just hit create. And now we can choose where we want to save our animation. Let's right click and create a separate folder for this. And let's call it animation. Let's then double click this folder. And let's also rename this animation file to something like player. And then underscore the animation that we want to work on. This could be run, jump, or die. In our case, let's start with an idle animation. In other words, the animation that the player plays when he isn't really doing anything. We can then press save. So now we have this empty timeline here where we can drag in our animation sprites. Of course, the great thing about our character here is that he already comes with a bunch of images that we can use. So let's go under Sunnyland. And of course, if you want to download any of this, I will have a link for that in the description. We then go under Artwork, Sprites, and under the player, we can see that the sprites are split up into animation folders. So let's start by going under the idle folder. And here are 4 different images. If we just try and select one of them, we can see a preview in the bottom right here. Of course, it's pretty tiny, but if I go ahead and move through the images, we can see that they are indeed animating our character. So let's try and select all 4 sprites, and let's simply click and drag them into our animation window. And right away, we can see that 4 keyframes has been added. We can also see that if I hit play, the animation plays ridiculously fast. The reason for this is that we need to change the amount of images that are displayed each second. Currently our samples are set to 60. A pretty standard value to use here is something like 12. We can see if we now play through, the animation looks much better. And we can even scrub through it using this timeline marker. And if we wanted to say move around a few images, we can of course do that by simply clicking and dragging, or just press delete in order to remove one. But I'm just going to leave my animation as is. And let's go ahead and set up a few other ones while we're at it. So let's go to where it says player idle here, and let's hit create new clip. Again, we want to make sure we do this inside the animation folder. And this time, let's create one called player_run. Now let's go under our run folder. Let's select all of our sprites and drag them in. Again, we want to decrease our samples to 12. And if we now hit play, we can see our character is running. Let's quickly do this for the crouch animation as well. So player_crouch. We'll go under the crouch folder, select both of them and drag them in. Again, we'll set the samples to 12. Again, the animation plays fine. And finally, let's add our jump animation. Player_jump. We'll go into the jump folder, select both sprites, drag them in, change the samples to 12. And if we try and play this one, we'll notice that it looks kind of weird. The reason is that our jump animation is made up of only 2 keyframes, one for when we are going upwards and one for when we are falling back down. Now we could of course go in and create these as 2 different animations. However, I think that's just overcomplicating things. Instead, I'm just going to go in and change the samples to a much lower value like 2. I think this is going to change our sprite around the time when we're at the peak of our jump, but we'll see that later. So now we've set up all 4 animation clips, and if we go into the animation folder, we can see all of them here: player idle, player crouch, run, and jump. And we can also see another file in here, simply called player, which has a different icon. This is what we call the animator controller. The animator controller is called a controller because it controls what animations to play. If we double click this, it's going to open up in our animator window. So here we notice that one of our windows is called animation. This is where we create our actual animations. And another one is called the animator because this is where we choose what animations we want to play. And in here we can also see that it's already added our 4 animation clips. We can now drag these around and arrange them in any way that we would like. And if for some reason one of them isn't in here for you, you can always take an animation clip from the project and simply drag it in. And you can of course also select and remove them. You'll notice here that currently the player idle is marked as orange, and it's connected with this arrow going from the green entry state. The reason for this is that the idle animation is currently our default animation. In other words, it's what will begin playing right when we start our game. So if we were to now hit play, we can see indeed our player starts playing the idle animation right away. And even though we move around and jump and try and crouch, it's just gonna keep playing idle. In fact, if we select our player and go under the animator, we can see the animation looping right here. So let's stop playing, and we can now start to create transitions from the idle animation to the other clips. By the way, if you want to set another animation as the default, we can always right click and hit set as their default state. And that's simply going to change it. So whenever we start running, we of course want to change from the idle animation to our run animation. And we do this using what is called a transition. So if we take our player run here and just place it underneath our idle animation, we then right click on our idle and hit make transition. And we now get this arrow that we can drag out to the other animation clips. If we then click player run, we've created a transition from our idle to our run animation. And if we select this transition, we can change when and how we want it to occur. So the first thing that we need here is to add a condition, because we don't want our transition to just play right away. We only want it to play in the case that we're actually moving. But currently our animator has no idea whether our character is moving or not. To change this, we use something called a parameter. So if we go to the left here, we can see that we have 2 tabs, layers and parameters. We want to go under parameters and hit the plus sign, and here we can now create a new parameter. We're going to create a float, and this float is going to represent our player's speed. So we'll call it speed, and we'll just default it to 0. Then under our condition, we can now hit the plus sign to create a new condition on our transition. And here we can say that we only want to transition to our run animation if our speed is greater than, and it will just input some small number like 0.01. In other words, if we start moving, well then we want to transition to a run animation. We also want to go in here and make sure that this transition is immediate. In other words, we don't want something called exit time, where we wait for the animation to stop playing before we start playing a new one. No, we simply want to transition as soon as we start moving. So I'm simply going to disable that. Let's also go under settings, and here we can choose the duration of our transition. This is not something that you often use when creating 2D games, but it's used all the time to blend between animations in 3D games. But for us, again, we want this to be completely immediate, so we'll go in and set the transition duration to 0. Of course, we also want to be able to transition back from our run animation. Currently, we will only be able to go from our idle to run, and then even though we stop moving, it will still play our run animation. So we'll go in here and right click and make a new transition. This one is going to go to idle. Let's select our transition and add a new condition. This time we only want to transition if the speed is less than, and then we'll again add a tiny number here, so 0.01. Again, we don't want any exit time, and under settings, we'll set the transition duration to 0. And now our animator should actually work with these 2 animations. In fact, if we take our animator and dog it to the right here, and then try to hit play, we can see that by default it plays the idle animation, but if I then go and change the speed, say set it to 1, our character starts running, and as soon as I set it back to 0, he goes right back to idling. So now all we need to do is change this speed parameter through our script, and that is actually fairly easy. So if we now select our player, and if you haven't watched the video where we set up player movement, we're basically using 2 scripts. One is the character controller that takes care of all the physics that go into making our character move. And the second one is a much simpler player movement script where we simply tell the player when to move and at what speed. So let's go ahead and open up this player movement script. And the first thing that we want is to be able to access our animator. Luckily, if we have a look in Unity, we can see that when we started creating animations for our player, Unity actually added an animator component to our player. And we don't need to do any adjustments in here. We can just see that the component is actually referencing the controller. And so that's why whenever we make a change to our animator controller, it applies to our player. So now we just need to be able to control our animator through our player movement script. And to do that, we need to reference it. So we'll go in here and create a public animator, and we'll just call it animator. And that's basically it. If we now save this and go into Unity, we can see that we have this empty animator field, and this is where we can drag in our animator component. So now every time we write animator in our script, we can access this component right here. And so if we go into the update function where we get our movement, we can actually go in here and write animator dot set float. And then we give it the name of the float that we want to set. Remember, this is the name of our parameter. So inside of our animator, we can see that the name of our parameter is speed. And notice that this has a capital S. So inside of our script, we can then write speed with a capital S like this, and then comma, and then we can give it the value that we want. In our case, we wanted to give it our current horizontal speed of our character, which is this horizontal move variable right here. So we'll simply write horizontal move and close it off with a semicolon. But there is a tiny mistake in here, and that is that our horizontal movement will be positive whenever we're going to the right, and it will actually be negative whenever we're moving to the left. And we want our speed variable to always be positive. So to change that, we can go in and use a handy little function called mathf.abs for absolute. So this is going to take the value and make sure that it's always positive. So if we now save this and go into Unity and hit play, we can see that as soon as we start moving, our character is going to play the run animation. And as soon as we stop, he goes right back to idling. Awesome. Now we want to be able to jump no matter what animation is currently playing. So whether we are idling or running, we always want to be able to jump off the ground. And so we could go in here and create a transition from each single clip to our jump animation. But as we add more clips, that would quickly become very tedious. So instead we can use this any state right here. And this basically allows us to create transitions from, well, any state. So no matter if we're idling or running, we can transition to our jump animation using this node here. So I'm just going to take this and drag it down and drag the entry up here to get it out of the way. And let's take our jump animation and drag it over here. And now we can transition from any state to jump. And of course, we still need to go in here and specify a condition. Otherwise, we're just going to be jumping all the time. And for this condition, we need a new parameter. So let's hit the plus sign. And this time we want it to be of type bool. Are we jumping or not? We'll call this is jumping. And we'll just set it to false by default. And then under the condition here, we can hit the plus sign. This time we don't want to check for speed. Instead, we want to check if is jumping is true. And again, if it is, we don't want any exit time. And we also want to set the transition duration to 0. Of course, we also want to be able to transition back from jumping. So let's go ahead and create a transition to the player idle here. And we only want this to play if we are currently not jumping. So is jumping is false. And our current speed is currently less than 0.01. And so this is really cool. We can add as many conditions to these transitions as we want. Let's also add one to play run. So we'll make another transition here. And this one we want to play in the case that, again, we are not jumping. So is jumping is false. And the speed is currently greater than 0.01. Again, we want to make sure to go through both these transitions and set has exit time to false and the transition duration to 0. And the same for the other one. And now our animator should be set up. Of course, we still need to make sure to control our isJumping parameter through our script. And if we go into our movement script, we can see that we currently get some input for whether or not we want to jump. And of course, we can go in here and set jumping to true. So we'll go animator.set bool this time because it's a boolean parameter that we want to change. The parameter is jumping. And here we want to set it to true. However, we actually don't have a way of knowing when we want to stop jumping, because all we're doing here is really giving our player controller input. There's no place in our code where we have anything about actually landing again. To get around this, I've gone ahead and added a bit of extra code to our character controller. If we select our player and open up the character controller, we can see that there's a section here called events. And in here, there's an on-land event. Events basically allows us to trigger certain functionality when something occurs. In this case, this event will be triggered whenever our character lands on the ground. And so we can use this to tell our player movement when to stop jumping. To do that, we need to go in and create a separate function for this. We'll create a void. We'll call it something like onLanding. We'll open and close some parentheses and the same with some curly brackets. And in here, all we want to do is tell our animator to stop jumping. So we'll go animator.setBall is jumping. And we'll set it to false. And this will work just fine, but in order for our event to be able to see this function, we need to mark it as public. And this might look a bit strange to you. Normally people associate public with variables, but we can actually make functions public as well. If we now save this and go into Unity, we can add a new onLand event. So we'll hit the plus sign here. And here we can feed in a component. So we want the player movement component. And then we can go and choose a particular function. We'll go under the player movement script. And in here we can now see our new onLanding function. If we select that and then play the game, we should see that whenever we jump, it plays our jump animation. And as soon as we land, it transitions right back. Super cool. We can also see that for some reason it only plays the first frame of our jump animation. And the reason for that is that if we go into our animator and check the transition going to our jump and then go under settings, it's currently set to can transition to self. So what's currently happening is that whenever we're jumping, it's actually just transitioning to jump over and over and over again. And so it's stuck on the very first part of that animation. If we remove that, it will only transition to jump once and then play the jump animation, and then as soon as it's done, it will either go idling or running. So if we play the game with that change, we can see that our jump animation works perfectly. And the final thing that we want to go in here and add is the crouch animation. So let's drag this to the side up here. And first we want to be able to crouch from idling. So we'll add a transition to crouch here. Let's select it and let's add a condition. But first we need a new parameter. So we'll go in here and create a boolean called isCrouching. And of course we want the condition to be that if crouching is true, well then we want to start crouching. Again, we want to remove exit time and duration. And we'll also create a transition back. This is if we are not crouching, so if crouching is false. And our speed is currently less than 0.01. And remove exit time and the duration. And I'm actually getting a warning here, and this happens sometimes when you set the transition duration to 0. It's pretty annoying and it will kind of spam your console with this warning. It doesn't really do anything to the code, but I found a nice workaround, which is to set the exit time a bit larger just before disabling it. It won't do any difference whatsoever, but it will make sure that we don't get this warning. We'll then create a transition from the run animation. Of course, the demand here is that isCrouching is true. Again, we'll remove exit time and duration. And finally, we want to be able to transition back in the case that we are no longer crouching and our speed is greater than 0.01. And here I'll use my trick, so bump up the exit time, remove it, and set the duration to 0. And there we go. That is it for our animator controller. Finally, let's set our isCrouching parameter through our script. And if we have a look at our player movement here, we can see that we do indeed control our crouching through this. However, there is one slight problem with this. And that is, in here we're only telling the character controller whether or not we want to crouch. However, sometimes our controller won't actually listen to our demands. Because if our character decides to crouch under a platform and then chooses to stand up, he won't be able to because there's a ceiling above him. And so we of course don't want to play an animation where our character stands up. That's going to look super weird. So just like jumping, we actually want our crouch animation to be controlled by our character controller. And of course, because of this, I've gone in and added an event for that as well. So if we go to our player and under the character controller 2D, we can see there's also an onCrouch event. And this is a tiny bit different from the onLand event in that it's actually a boolean event, which means that not only will this trigger a function when we start crouching, it's also going to trigger the same function when we stop crouching. And it's going to tell the function whether or not we started or stopped crouching using a boolean. So to show you how this works, let's go into our player movement and let's create another function under our onLanding. Again, this is going to be a public void and we'll call it onCrouching. And this time we're going to take in a boolean variable as an argument. We'll call this something like isCrouching. We'll also open and close some curly brackets. And now this variable here is actually going to be controlled by our character controller. So that if we are crouching, this is going to be true. And if we're not, it's going to be false. So we can simply go ahead and set our bool on the animator. So animator.setBool. And we want to set the isCrouching parameter. We can set that depending on our isCrouching variable right here. So we'll simply pass that in directly. And now if we save that, go into Unity and add a new onCrouch event. Again, we want to drag in our player movement. We want to go under our player movement script here. And we can see our onCrouching function. However, we can also see our onCrouching function at the top here under dynamic bool. And that's because if we select this one at the top, it's going to automatically pass in the right boolean. So let's select that. And let's take our animator and dock it to the bottom here so we can see everything happening while we are playing. We then hit play. And now when we crouch, we can see that we transition to the crouch animation. And we can also crouch under this obstacle, and if we try and stand up, it's not gonna work. So now we can jump and run around, we can idle and we can crouch, and everything is going to work just fine. It's always going to play the correct animation. Super cool. That's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Also, exciting news! We're moving into a new office and should be hard at work setting everything up once this video goes live. This also means that we have to skip next week's video, but we'll be back with new videos as soon as we get settled in. And if you want to follow our progress and get behind the scenes updates, I suggest following us on Twitter at Brackeys tweet. And that, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks to all of the awesome Patreon supporters who donated in June, and a special thanks to Michael Neely, Clinton Van Skewer, Andrew Kalinenko, Cheetah3D, Alexander Blair, Cyborg Mummy, Jeff Paulson, Dennis Sullivan, Superman the Great, Faisal Marify, Derek Heemskirk, Fang So Long, Leo Lisette, Tim of Holderbach, Adrian Haslinger, James Rogers, Rob Farron, Gregory Pierce, Naoki Iwasaki, Larry Tweed, Erasmus, Bruins Cat, Obrisi, Corey Jackson, Kirill Svidersky, James P, and Robert Bund. You guys rock!